Yeah.
We just don't have Bob, but that's the only, do we not worry about that?
On to theme 2. Thanks, sir. Yesterday we had theme 1, where we had Michael Patton and Emily Gates and Charmaine Patton give us a big picture overview of systems. If anyone missed those 2 sessions because of time zone differences or you couldn't make it, my colleague Shira can share in the chat the links. They're all up on the website, so you should be able to access them. And remember, if you want to earn the certificate, you can still watch the recording and answer the survey to earn the certificate. So today we're moving on to theme 2. We have 2 sessions today around seeing and understanding complex systems. And this series has been curated with NORC, so Margaret Hargreaves at NORC, and ECDAN. So this is part of our broader systems initiative where I've shared previously, where we have systems research, where in fact in the past with Sharon Goldfield at MCRI, we've done a lot of work around that together. Systems investing, systems measurement, systems design and implementation. And today we're focusing on the system measurement component of the broader systems initiative that we have undergoing with the support of Porticus. Thank you very much, Porticus. Just a reminder, we do have digital certificates that you can earn throughout this series, and to earn them we need you to register for each session that you would like to attend, complete the homework. The homework is really important because it gives you that foundation and that background to this entirely new field that we're all exploring collectively. Participate in at least 7 out of the 14 sessions, live or recorded, but they need to be done before May 17th so that we can issue all the certifications by then, and then complete the short survey after each session. So Shreya, can you pop in this link to the survey so people have that right from the start? All right. You will have access to everything. Everything will be on the website. I think we get asked this constantly, but you will have access to all the recording, all the presentations, all the resources, as well as ECD Connect. A lot of you have already signed into that. Great. Let's have discussions there post the Masterclass series, and we'll have the experts over the next 2 weeks answer questions you may have. Each of the format of the Masterclass is pretty basic. We'll have a welcome introduction, the Masterclass session, the dialogue with the early childhood expert, and participant Q&A. So just as a reminder, please put in your Q&A, click on the Q&A chat, and put your questions in the Q&A or we may miss them. For the Q&A, you should have the ability to vote and comment as well, and read answered questions as well. And if you want to have a chat, please make sure, some of you have done this, but please make sure you're responding to everyone and not just hosts and panelists, because if it's hosts and panelists only, we can read your lovely comments. All right, with that, we also have Spanish translation with big thanks to UNICEF LACPRO. Really grateful for that support. So if you need Spanish translation, you can go in interpretation and click on Spanish. And a big thank you to Mitzi, our translator, who's with us. Wonderful. So today we have session 3, which is right now with Bob Williams, and I'll introduce him, and Sharon Goldfield. And then in a few hours at 8 a.m. Eastern, in about 4 hours, we have the 4th session with Aaron Watson and Rebecca. So without further ado, let me introduce both Bob and Sharon to you. Just one quick second. So Bob Williams, he has been working at the nexus of evaluation and systemic practice for over 30 years. We're so lucky to have him here today. He's widely recognized for his work for promoting systems approaches and concepts in the evaluation field. He's conducted several workshops, trainings, consultations, and systems thinking, program evaluation, performance measurement, organizational development, and program logic across the globe. He's published several articles. You can go to his website. It's a great resource. There's a lot of free stuff there. He's the author of 6 books on bringing together the field of systems practice and evaluation. He's also the recipient of the American Evaluation Association's Paul Lazarsfeld Evaluation Theory Award for his contributions to the field. And our early childhood expert with us today is Sharon Goldfield. She's the director of the Center of Community Child Health at the Royal Children's Hospital. She's the professor and a pediatrician, a public health researcher, and policy advisor focusing on child development and health equity. She's the director of the Center for Community Child Health at the Royal Children's Hospital and theme director for population health at the Murdoch Children's Research Institute, with over a decade of experience in state government as a senior public servant in health and education and an outstanding track record. Sharon, she has successfully straddled research and policy. Her expertise is highly sought after, with appointments to government, expert advisory groups, and health, education, and social services department, including her recent appointment to the National Early Years Strategy Advisory Group. So we have the whole early childhood system in Sharon with us. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Bob. Oh, Bob, would you mind renaming yourself? Maybe I could just do it for you because you're right now also Sharon.
I make a very good Sharon. I have no idea why I've suddenly become Sharon. There we go.
This is what happens in ECD, Bob. We just take over the world.
All right, Bob and Sharon, over to you.
Yeah, there's another slight glitch that we've had just as a warning to people. We had some sound troubles that we hope we've sorted out. But Sharon, do you have the backup there? If
Shreya has the backup. Shreya has the backup, Bob. So we're good to go if yours fails.
We're good to go. But anyway, we'll go with Plan A first, and if Plan A works, then we're fine. Oh. That looks promising. Let's do the usual. Now, let's just, is everything going? You can see what's going, and we'll fingers crossed that when I push the button, the sound will come on. So what I'm going to do is what we're going to do is really build on what Michael, Charmaine, and Emily have said about systems so far, for those of you who've seen it before. Now, they focused on sort of general principles, and initially, so will I. In fact, I'll be using some versions of the illustrations that you've already seen from those presentations. Someone's got their...
I think Shreya, you'll have to mute.
There we go. Thank you. What this does is into a sort of a rather deeper dive in this, and also provide some important context into a particular systems method called critical systems heuristics. It's one of the many options that Emily mentioned earlier on, and explores the implications of some of Michael's comments, that the boundaries that we make in any systemic inquiry are social as well as physical constructs, and they relate very much to our worldviews and values. The boundary operating principle 2 that Charmaine also mentioned as well. So consequently, this particular method, critical systems heuristics, is very relevant to issues of equity and the values that do or should underpin ECD, as well as evaluations of ECD. Now, fingers crossed, if this goes well, it will be a pre-recorded presentation. It lasts just a bit over half an hour. And about halfway through, I will pause and ask you to do a task, so be prepared for that, that applies the 4 main elements of critical systems to something that you've already been involved in. It doesn't have to be big or complex. It could be getting the kids off to school in the morning. Now, once that presentation is finished, then Sharon and I will use a case example to explore some of the details of critical systems, and then we'll kind of step back and discuss any broader issues that the approach raises. We'll also keep an eye on the comments, of course, that you make in the chat, and we'll have a go at addressing them. So keep them rolling in. So fingers crossed. Here we go.
In this presentation, I'm going to be describing a particular systems approach called critical systems heuristics. Of all the systems approaches I know, the ideas that underpin critical systems heuristics have probably influenced my practice the most. I'm going to focus on its use in equitable practice, because critical systems heuristics is fundamentally about surfacing the values we aspire to and the values we practice, and equity is at the core of much early childhood development practice. I'll also talk a lot about evaluation And I don't only mean evaluation with a big E, but also the evaluative practice we undertake as part of our day-to-day work. Now, as the presentation proceeds, I encourage you to make a link with a particular practice and pose and consider these three questions. What do I do consciously? What do I do unconsciously? And how do I deliberate about them? Now, in 15 minutes or so, I'll stop and give you some time to write down and explore these questions, so be prepared. But before we dive into critical systems heuristics, let's take a step back. The systems field is both old and large. It is informed by ideas that date back literally thousands of years from many parts of the world. The modern systems field emerged from Russian and Austrian thinkers and other practitioners in the early part of the 20th century. And over the past 100 years or so, the field has drawn on many other fields that have inevitably contributed to a large diversity of ideas, interpretations, and cultural orientations. In my experience, the US field of systems is different from the one in the UK, is different from the one in Germany, is different from the one in China, and certainly is different from the various systemic approaches that have emerged in South America. Now, this particular diagram produced by one of systems field's leading figures, Ray Eisen, gives you some idea of that scale and scope. On the left-hand side, he lists a range of fields that have informed modern systems practice. And as you move more towards the right, the center of the diagram, you go through what I would call the emergence of specific disciplines within the overall field. And moving further to the right, there are methodologies and methods that have emerged from those disciplines and subdisciplines. Now, Ray ordered these along a continuum. At the top are methods and methodologies that are primarily describing the world as it is, the objective reality. In other words, there are methods and methodologies that are primarily ontological. They describe the world as it is. At the bottom are methods and methodologies that explore the world as people see and understand it. In other words, subjective realities. In other words, again, they're primarily methods and methodologies that are epistemological in nature, about learning. Now, as you can see, critical systems heuristics falls right at the most extreme epistemological end. Indeed, in my view, it enters the third great area of exploration, that of axiology, the study of values and valuing. Perhaps for no other reason that suggests its possible relevance to evaluators who ought to be, although often or not, interested in the nature of valuing. To get a somewhat less philosophical understanding of the role and potential of critical systems heuristics, let's start at the very beginning, and that is of what comprises a system. Now, there are many individual definitions, but overall they hover around one that was developed by Dick Morris at the Open University many years ago. Here's my version of Dick's definition. A system is a collection of entities that are perceived by someone as interacting together to achieve something. A system is a collection of entities that are perceived by someone as interacting together to achieve something. Let me illustrate that in a slightly different way. The definition can be split into three elements. The first one is interrelationships, a collection of entities interacting together. The second is about perspectives that are perceived by someone. And finally, to achieve something can be regarded as setting boundaries. The reason why achieving something is about boundaries is because to achieve something, you have to focus on something. And in focusing on something, there will be things that fall outside of that focus. In other words, you've drawn a boundary between what is in and what is out of your system. In other words, all systems have a purpose. Now, it may be specifically identified, or it may be what people perceive the purpose for to be. And it's for that reason systems are always human constructs. People can identify different purposes of the system, even when the interrelationships are the same. However, in our evaluation craft, we don't just want to describe systems. We want to use systems ideas to influence our evaluation practice and the interventions we evaluate. We want to do stuff. We want to engage in systemic practice. Systemic practice is more than merely describing systems. Systems practice, systemic practice, is about stepping into those interacting entities and influencing, or at least altering the course if possible, of those changes. And I want to stress that this could be within the intervention we're evaluating, or indeed in our evaluation practice. So to turn this description of a system into systemic practice, you need to add some verbs. And here they are. Understand interrelationships. In other words, addressing the question, what is the reality that we're actually dealing with? Engage with perspectives. How do people interpret that reality? And finally, decide on boundaries. In other words, working out what actually is the desirable and feasible thing to do in the vast array of possibilities that we have. Now, critical systems heuristics is a systemic approach to deciding on boundaries, to assist our process of desiring, of arriving at the desirable and feasible thing to do. Now, a common misperception is that systemic approaches are about looking at everything, the old holism thing. In fact, by now you may be realizing that the reverse is true. Every systemic practice, every intervention, every evaluation is bounded in some way. It's impossible to view and understand every single interrelationship at every available scale. It's impossible to accommodate every single perspective. In order to be able to do anything, we end up having to draw boundaries. Without boundary decisions, we just can't do anything. We will just stand in the lights, scared like a rabbit in the headlights. And when I say doing, I don't just mean actions. These boundaries can be of ideas, of ideologies, of thoughts. So for instance, in evaluation, we don't just make decisions about time or budget or method. We make those boundary choices, but we also make boundary judgments and boundary choices about criteria, equity, efficiency, effectiveness. And these criteria enable us, they give us the boundaries to make judgments of whether something is of significance or not, of value or not, or of merit or not in terms of those criteria. These are all vital boundaries that allow us to say that something is worthwhile or not, something is significant or not. So essentially, without boundaries, there is no evaluation system. So what are we doing when we make boundary decisions? Now, this issue concerned the systems thinker C. West Churchman, who developed the field of critical systems. He concluded that there will be winners and losers in every boundary decision. And in terms of losers, this can be as simple as falling below the set of standards of a criterion in an evaluation. In other words, be ineffective or inefficient or uncaring, whatever the criteria happens to be. Or they can be as complex as feeling that their interests have been marginalized by the evaluation or the intervention. And since people or things will be profoundly affected by these boundary decisions, Churchman considered that boundary decisions are actually primarily ethical rather than primarily technical. And because they are primarily ethical, they have to be justified in ethical, not just technical terms. We have to be able to claim that whatever boundaries we draw are the right boundaries to draw, ethically, as well as technically. Some people will challenge these claims, and they may have the power and agency to undermine that claim. Therefore, we need to think about, deliberate upon, whether we just seek to boost our argument for the rightness of our claim, or from an ethical point of view, negotiate an alternative set of boundaries that accommodate this particular challenge in some way. So what we're at the position now is that these in-out decisions that we make, these boundary decisions that we make, are not only technical but are also ethical, and therefore require ethical deliberation on the consequences, given that people will be at least marginalized, or ideas will be at least marginalized. The problem is that we make literally hundreds and hundreds of boundary decisions in any particular evaluation. They're decisions of space, of time, of purpose, of money, of control, of knowledge, of perspectives. Which ones should we focus on? We have to, therefore, make some boundary decisions about our boundary decisions. Now, every evaluation situation is different, so is it possible to identify some generic decisions that are vital in every circumstance? One of Churchman's students, interested in an evaluator and social planner, Werner Inricht, identified 4 such key boundary decision areas and developed a series of questions of heuristics around that. And critical systems heuristics was born. The first of these 4 areas is purpose. In other words, this is a decision between who benefits from an intervention, including the evaluation, and by implication who does not. Who gains, who loses. Then there's the decision over who controls the necessary resources to achieve those benefits. And that's a boundary decision between who has autonomy over those resources and who has the ultimate control of whether those resources are available. In order to use resources, you need information about what kinds of resources and so on. So there is an issue of knowledge and necessary decisions around whose or what knowledge and expertise is used in managing these resources. What knowledge systems is used, for instance, and what knowledge systems are ignored. That's a very live challenge to evaluation right now. And then finally, there is a question of what Ulrich called legitimacy. This is a complex area, but fundamentally it poses questions around the decision about whose or what interests have to be satisfied in order to ensure that the benefits actually occur. It's a boundary choice between desirability, ideal desirability, and the actual feasibility of seeing what you have actually work on the ground and be sustained. Now, these might seem like simple generic questions, but actually answering them exposes significant issues around the use of power, of equity and control of both the intervention and the evaluation. It raises issues around knowledge systems and the reality of compromises and trade-offs necessary, including the compromises and trade-offs necessary for our evaluations to achieve what we wish them to achieve. And the issue of legitimacy around that is a really important aspect of critical systems heuristics, and I would argue something that evaluators really do need to actually take closer understanding at. We're all very interested in the consequences of our evaluation. Legitimacy is a major contributor to whether things are considered legitimate or not. But here's the way that critical systems heuristics actually handles this. The first three aspects, purpose, control, and knowledge, are essentially about who benefits and how they benefit. But the legitimacy aspect brings you down to earth with a bump. Critical systems heuristics people argue that the legitimacy, and hence the feasibility and sustainability of your system, cannot be determined by those who are inside your system. Inside your system are people who will benefit from the system in a pretty direct way. They mostly will support you. Your legitimacy is relatively certain. However, instead, the critical systems people argue, critical systems heuristics argues, that legitimacy is primarily gained by addressing the needs and desires of those who are not part of the system, but whose interests are negatively affected by it. And here is a classic example. A car in a cycle lane. In other words, town planners, cycling groups, cyclists cannot legitimize cycle lanes. The only people who can ultimately legitimize cycle lanes are power drivers and maybe shopkeepers, local shopkeepers or whatever, but they are essentially people who are rightly or wrongly perceive themselves affected by, negatively, by a system of which they are not part. So then the deep ethical question is then, how much of those interests do you sweep in, do you include, do you bring into your system before you risk up actually undermining the possibility of the very benefits that you desire? Indeed, if you sweep too much in, you essentially create another system with different issues around what is its purpose, what are the controls, and what are the knowledge, and yes, what's the legitimacy. Only this time, someone or someone else will be negatively affected. Let's pause here for a bit and allow you to gather your breath. Earlier, I suggested that you keep some project in mind. Well, here's a chance for you to play with it. Think about that particular project, or any project, big or small, and consider what boundary choices you made, conscious and unconscious, in terms of purpose, control, knowledge, and legitimacy. And then write them down. Cue music, and I'll be coming back in a couple of minutes. Welcome back. How did you find the task? Challenging or easy? If you found it challenging, then the next part may actually make it easier. And if you found it easy, in fact, you might find the next part a bit more challenging. There are a total of 12 questions in critical systems heuristics, 3 for each of the 4 major areas. One question tends to explore the who boundary decision, one the what boundary decision, and the third can be considered a kind of so what. It explores some key issues that are raised by the what and the who boundary decisions. They often imply a further boundary decision. And since they are heuristics, a major task is not just bolting the questions on, but adapting the ideas behind the questions to the particular circumstance. Let me step through them progressively. And note that I refer to the intervention and the evaluation, and that's because, as you heard many times in this talk, evaluation itself is an intervention, so we can not only apply these issues to the evaluand, but also most critically to our own evaluation practice. And as I go through these questions, I suggest you reflect on just how consciously you address these questions in your own evaluation designs. Reflect on, or to put it more systemically, how these questions are consciously addressed in the evaluation system that you and others are part of. Okay, so first, purpose. The 3 what, who, and so what questions relate to purpose, what, those who will benefit from that purpose, the who, and the third poses the question, how would you know? Now, in evaluation language, this is a measurement issue. And for me, this is one of the most intriguing parts of CSH because it makes you understand that what you measure and how you measure it are all value-based decisions. They're based on our beliefs and values of how you observe the world. Indeed, for each question, there is a question of what the beliefs and values that underpin your boundary choice of purpose, of beneficiaries, of those who are going to win, and the decisions on measurement, and what criteria you wish to use in order to assess whether that belief or value is adequately reflected in your evaluation. Now, note that these questions are in a neutral or observational mode, is, will. But in most situations, and this is where the evaluative aspect really comes in, they also need to be asked in a normative, value explicit mode, the could, the should, and the ought. And that then gives you the opportunity, should you wish, to compare the should, what is desirable, with what actually is. And that comparison can also be subjected to further assessment and associated criteria. So next, let's explore the tension between autonomy and control. In this case, the what question relates to the necessary resources in order to bring those benefits and achieve the purpose. The who relates to those who have autonomy to manage the resources. And the so what explores where the locus of control is or ought to be. And in each of those 3, identifies the value issues that arise from the boundaries between autonomy and control. And again, it's in 2 modes. And again, it gives you an opportunity to reflect on the difference between the 2. And as you can expect, the knowledge questions lead to an assessment of how you would monitor and evaluate whether the boundaries of what knowledge is used, by whom, and what knowledge is ignored, and how that difference is assessed continuously. And again, in both modes, and subject to some kind of comparison. And finally, as you can probably guess, the legitimacy part raises a bunch of questions about how to ensure as much of the desirable explored in the first three groups of questions can be made feasible. And this requires understanding the value base of those who may consider themselves or their interest ignored or marginalized. So we look at what is negatively affected. Who is negatively affected? What are their beliefs and values that make them feel negatively affected? And then what are actually the trade-offs and compromises that you need to gain to develop sufficient legitimacy so that your endeavor is going to be feasible and sustainable in spite of these marginalized issues and marginalized people? What value base underpins your trade-offs in that particular case? And again, you can put these into the should mode, a bit more difficult to answer, and then begin to make some kinds of comparisons. So what does this all mean for equity and equitable evaluations? Well, a lot of hard questions with answers that will be uncomfortable and difficult for some. Let's go through this item by item. Now, obviously, clearly, we can use critical systems heuristics to identify purposes and those who benefit from an equitable framing and work out what that means in equitable terms. But what about measurement? Not only how we're going to observe whether there have been benefits, but how do we decide on these measures that are themselves based on values of equity? Now, I honestly don't have an answer to that, but we do know that disadvantaged people literally see and experience the world differently from we do. They will measure things differently than we do. And that has deep equitable dimensions. In terms of control, the issues are primarily over who actually has control over the intervention or the evaluation. What would be an equitable balance, for instance, between involvement in resource decisions and control of the intervention's purpose and benefits, control over those resource decisions? Issues to do with autonomy over the resource decisions. How involved who should be? And to what extent should those who are the recipients of the benefits of an intervention, including the evaluation, should be involved in either the resource decisions themselves or the control of the intervention's purposes and benefits, and the evaluation's purposes and benefits? There's not a lot to say about the knowledge issue. The questions have been trod very often in discussions within evaluation around whose knowledge systems are used and respected and those that are not. This just adds a few more questions to those important debates that are going on in evaluation right now. The legitimacy area is something that I think we need to kind of focus a bit more on, because the questions imply that as an evaluator, you have an ethical responsibility to consider the impact of your evaluation or the intervention on those who may be disadvantaged by a program based on equitable principles or an evaluation based on equitable principles. Now, that's not to say you have to do anything about that, but it does raise the issue of your responsibility to those you wish to benefit from the program. How do you do that in a way without effectively promoting a backlash that may ultimately mean that the consequences of the benefits are either not achieved or sustained? What values will inform or ought to inform the decisions to trade off particular benefits for longer term sustainability? And then how ought we to evaluate those particular value judgments? So that's critical systems for you. Now, apart from all of the questions that we've gone through in some kind of detail, when you get kind of underneath the role of critical systems heuristics, it really is to enable you to state, either in your practice or in the evaluation, that you have a basis upon which you can claim that whatever you've done or whatever you intend to do was the right thing to do. Was it the right intervention? And was it the right evaluation? Now, obviously, there are many different ideas around that, and it's not necessary to arrive at a point where you just stand up and say it's the right thing to do. After all, you probably wouldn't have done it in the first place if you didn't believe that. But now you've got some way of constructing an argument, and if you can't instruct that, have an argument that enables for you to do what you want to do in an unfettered way, then it begins to look at what trade-offs that you might actually need to undertake in order to be able to sustain the both what is desirable, but in a feasible and sustainable way. Now, in doing this, I've focused on essentially areas to do with equity. And that's because within the early childhood development area, equity is clearly an important aspect. But you could probably think of any particular criterion that underpins the basis upon which you wish to claim that whatever you're doing is the right thing to do.
Okay. So that's critical systems heuristics. What Sharon and I are now going to do is have a conversation about critical systems with respect to a particular example from the early childhood development area. Sharon, do you just want to quickly, and we'll basically go back through the heuristic and focus on some of the sort of more difficult and interesting areas. But first off, Sharon, do you want to just give us an overview of the project? Yeah.
Yeah, and first of all, can I also just say fantastic questions coming through, and just to thank you, Bob,
God,
for that really challenging overview. And, you know, this idea of heuristics, these kind of shortcuts to our thinking that might challenge us in the way that we're thinking about early childhood development, which of course we'll talk about a little bit later. But, you know, we deal in microsystems in early childhood development as well, of course, because there's the child in the family. And there's a whole conversation about who benefits and who doesn't benefit at the child level and the family level, as well as the community level.
Exactly.
So there's all these, there's a complexity, which is what is, I think sometimes, to your point, that rabbit in the headlight kind of point where you're going, how do we deal with that complexity? Because we have to take into account the child and the parent. That might be at the micro level. You know, my clinical work is at the micro level. The research work, though, is at the broader level. So thank you for that. I think these are really challenging and interesting hooks for us, and I think that's why you're getting the questions that are coming through, which I think are really, really interesting. The other is, and I do want to say this because and this is specific for where we are, the longitude that we're on, but also the fact that I'm coming to you from Australia and Bob is in New Zealand, and that is to just our tradition here in Australia, at least, would be to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we're on. So I feel that's important to just stop for a moment and do that. I'm on the land of the Bunurong people, and I would like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and in particular acknowledge any First Nations people in the audience in any country, anywhere in the world that is joining us today, and in particular here in Australia, to acknowledge that this land has never been ceded. So on to talking about this particular, I was a bit challenged by this. I said, well, I don't know what one to put up. I don't know. And I gave him a few, I gave him a menu, and he chose this one. This is kind of really interesting. And I think I was kind of reflecting on these heuristics as we were going through, but I'll just give you a very quick summary. I'm hoping what you're seeing on the slide now gives you a sense of this. And this absolutely had equity at the heart. So there's two issues for early childhood development. I think, Bob, you've hit the nail on the head, and that equity is very near and dear to the hearts of those of us working in early childhood. But the other is a developmental perspective, an idea of what do we actually do for children in these very young ages, where we know that what we do now is incredibly important, now for now, if you like, but also incredibly important for thinking about how these children emerge over time. So that developmental perspective, because what we do developmentally for an infant is quite different to what we might do for a 2 to 3 year old, which is again different to what you might do for a 5-year-old. So Right at Home is based on the idea of, when we conceptualized it, and I should say it's co-designed as well with end users, and we can have a whole debate about who the end users are here in terms of the staff who deliver it and the families who receive it. But it was designed to essentially be based off a universal opportunity for public health nursing to deliver to families who might need something additional in order for them to be to sort of have the sort of parenting opportunities that they all want for their children. And so it's based in the home. It's there's a whole international evidence base about it, but no one had really done this sort of work in Australia, and this is a randomized controlled trial. And what's been really interesting about this is, first of all, what's really interesting in what happens when you give power to families, when the practitioner gives power over to families so that they're actually working out what they want to get out of a visit, and how do you measure that? I guess we can have a long debate about that. The second is how do you measure the impacts over time on issues that are meaningful, that we know are meaningful from a development point of view, but are meaningful, again, to the end users. And third of all, and I was noticing some of the comments that came through, and there was one from, I did pick up the Australians because I know I can talk sensibly about that, which is Luke Williams was talking about what's desirable versus feasible, and the challenge. And I think this issue of feasibility is really interesting. How do you take something that actually is, from a research point of view, this had impact both on the children and on the parents, but how do, well, as mothers actually, I should say, but how do you actually then ensure that that's able to actually be taken up in order to and for sufficient families to actually benefit from it? And then who does benefit and who gets in the way? And I just think that's been really interesting for us. We've not been able to take this to a level of scale that we think would benefit a whole lot of families. And we can have a chat then, Bob, about what we think's gotten in the way, because I think the dissonance between desirable and feasible is really interesting, depending on who it's desirable for and it's who it's feasible for. And that's both a combination of reality and values, I think. So I thought this was an interesting one because it is a fundamental, from a public health point of view, one of the most effective public health interventions that we've tested. It's a really important part of the stack of things. I can't sit here. One of the challenges in early childhood, Bob, is there's no silver bullets. I don't think any of us would think here and go, look, just do my program. I'll put my feet up. And once it's all done, all the early childhood, everything will change. So we sit in this complexity, which is why we've chosen to go down this systems approach and sort of stare into that complexity and say, how do we sort of try and make sense of this so that we can actually make a difference for children and their families, at least try and do it in the next decade if we can. So Bob, maybe I'll turn to you, and then, just so everybody online knows, Bob and I will riff a bit, and then we'll reflect back a bit more, and then we'll have time to answer. There's now 15 questions in the Q&A. We might ask our colleagues at ECDUN to bundle some of those up for us so that we can answer some of those questions. So Bob, over to you.
Yeah, and certainly
and we can chat. Like
some of the questions will actually come up around power, about what we mean by marginalized. I think will come up within some of the questions. So let me just change the slide. Ooh, too many slides. Go back. So this is the sort of first suite of questions, and we obviously don't have time, in this conversation to go through them. So we've decided to kind of focus on ones that are particularly gnarly. And I think you've already, Sharon, raised one of them, which is how will you know, and what are the values that underpin that way of finding out? You've mentioned, for instance, it was a random controlled trial. There are certain values that underpin that, certain worldviews that underpin that. And I just wonder if you would like to kind of riff on the consequences of that. If we were evaluating it, for instance, if we were evaluating your methodology, what kind of criteria would we use based on the values that underpin that particular approach to knowing, who does and who doesn't benefit? How would you know?
And I think I can see that there are some questions coming through about this setting of boundaries, and maybe that's related to this. And Bob, you can sort of respond back to that, because I think it's sort of, I was thinking about when you start with the end in mind, which is kind of what you're talking about here, as in terms of both in the boundaries, who's in and who's out, and what's in and what's out, because that's absolutely necessary. But also, what are the beliefs and values you bring to that? So one of the beliefs and values and the reasons for doing randomized control trials is to ensure that an intervention, whatever you want to call it, actually is impactful. So in other words, I can tell you the research world is littered with lots of things that people loved that actually have made very little difference to human outcomes. And I think human outcomes are really, I guess I'm reflecting my own values. I think human outcomes are a really important part of what we're trying to achieve here. And the other is how being successful, I guess, is making sure or thinking about the sorts of families that were included in this study and whether or not they really reflected the equity lens, which in this study they did. But that was a really important driver for us, because there are lots of interventions that get rolled out that do not actually reach the families for which they were actually intended. That's a real challenge in research. And so I think those are kind of, I think that's both the purpose and a bit about the boundaries we set ourselves.
Yeah, I've got two comments on that, and from a critical systems point of view, and one of them is that's how you know, but is that how the beneficiaries or some of the other people involved would define what's a benefit and what's a success and how they measure it? I mean, this is a major issue here in Aotearoa around Māori worldviews versus Pākehā worldviews. They have different, the two cultures have different ways of measuring. So, and a systems person would say that the notion of a counterfactual in a complex system is an illusion. It's actually based on a worldview that has no basis in reality. No, I'm not. I'm role playing here. So those are the sorts of things that a discussion, and again, it has to be a participatory one, which I think I didn't emphasize. That ideally these things, critical systems falls in an area known as emancipatory system, which is a terrible word in one level, but a brilliant word in another, is that it's actually about allowing people, and there are issues of power here, I acknowledge, but allowing issues to raise up that maybe were perhaps not discussable. Anyway, let's move on, because we're going to.
But it's just probably worth adding, and then and I just think it's worth adding the importance of co-design, because I think you're right. In terms of the beneficiaries, I think. And this was co-design, which is what do families actually want out of these sort of services that meets their needs. And also, as I said, ceding power in the interactions. There's a whole lot of issues around the power between a health professional and a parent. And there's a lot of power that needs to be ceded by the health professional to allow the voice of the parent to come to the fore. And I think a part of this program was working on that. But I think those are really in the field of health, these are really massive issues about how you cede power to allow the voice of the beneficiary to come to the fore, to allow them to actually work on the things that this is a worldview that's important for their worldview, and not necessarily the health professionals' worldview.
And I think that segues very nicely into the control area, which is who ultimately has the ability to say that the resources that are used in a particular intervention, who actually controls those resources, not manages them, but actually has in systems language, the power to stop the system. Who, in this particular case, ought to have that power, and who does? It raises issues of accountability, which is a concept in complex systems, which I don't think works particularly well because of the rather conservative way in which people understand accountability. But it is very much about those issues of who has ultimate control over whether or not, over who decides what the purpose is and the benefits are. And you've started to explain some of the strategies that you had to address those issues.
Yeah, I think this is really interesting, and I don't know if you've got more questions you want to share, Bob, or whether you stop sharing and then we can sort of have a bit more of a broader chat, because I'm just...
Well, yes, I do, but I want... this is the problem with critical systems, is that people don't want to get into the difficult questions, but want to stand back and
I want to get into the difficult questions. I just don't... I want to make sure the audience can see us and not just the slides. So I think the issue... Yeah, I'm happy to talk about the resource issues. Because it's been a very interesting question in community and place-based sort of work that's been going on around the world. Who makes decisions of where should the resources be allocated, for example, for how communities think about what they're doing for their families. So it's a really live issue in that space in terms of where the governance should be, where the resourcing should be. And how does that work? And again, who holds the power and how do you ensure equity in that space? And in this particular one, I just want to sort of out some particular tensions in all of this issue about the resourcing and the resourcing, who holds the resourcing. Because if I'm going to falsely give people boundaries, but anyway, I'll do it for the sake of this conversation. So if you can imagine, there's the kind of policy perspective on this, which is who holds the actual resourcing in terms of, investment. There's the delivery of these services, so who holds the resources in deciding what the providers should be. And there's the family themselves, who has their own internal resources, as well as the ability to think about how they might, if you like, access the resources that are available to them. And I find, certainly in our work, and I'm sure you do as well, they rarely align where there's an agreement on the allocation and the thinking about those resources, so that, and I know that people have been saying the thing about who benefits and who doesn't, but actually it's really interesting where the blockages lie sometimes, or where the obstructions might lie in terms of thinking through some of those resource allocations. So, for example, sometimes the blockage is actually at the provider level. So the policy is there, but the providers actually don't want to do the work, don't find that it's something they want to do. Sometimes the providers really want something to do, but the policy environment just means, that they cannot, the resource allocations and the power they aren't there. But I do think from an evaluation point of view, these are really helpful ways of thinking through some of these sorts of things, both in evaluating, and I'm going to use the word outing, which is kind of what an evaluation is, outing and being clear about some of these tensions, and I guess staring them down and being able to articulate them.
I mean, the issue of control, which incidentally somebody asked the question about, there are some things that are outside of our control. Exactly. So what do you, but of those that you have some degree of influence and control over, who fundamentally ought to be able to decide, make that decision that the resources, whatever they are going to go to fulfill this purpose and have these benefits. So we'll move on to knowledge. We can have a whole day's discussion on whose knowledge is acknowledged and whose knowledge is marginalized. Clearly, in the description that you've had of this particular project, it's something that you thought about quite deeply. Can you just talk about that and the relevance of the kinds of questions that critical systems ask around that?
And I think it's really interesting and very live in both our countries in terms of exactly the First Nations kind of thinking, where both our countries have a long history of devaluing actually that knowledge, but it's probably for a longer conversation. So in this particular example, it was really interesting about how you bring the different knowledges to the table, and we were very keen on the parent as expert being the knowledge that was the primary knowledge, with the health provider actually coming in behind that parent, but that fundamentally the parent is the expert of their child, which is what we would see as the kind of fundamental, what we call parent or family-centered practice. That's not necessarily practiced everywhere, but in this particular approach, that's exactly what we were doing. We were trying to bring the parent knowledge and the parent expertise to the fore, and the parent then guided the questions, and the parents sought out the sort of knowledge that they were interested in. So that's what we used for this particular project.
So here's an interesting question. Was there any system of knowledge that you accidentally or deliberately excluded? And what was the value that was around that particular decision?
So you're right. So there were some drivers that we also utilised. So, for example, that while the parents' expertise came to the fore, there's also a vast knowledge of neurodevelopment that we wanted to include as well. So for the ECD experts who are all online today, this won't be a surprise to them, but there is two fundamental pieces of science that were really important, that were drivers for us. One is the fact that the child's brain, as the child's brain is developing, the environments that children are growing up in are really important. And in particular, the ability to bond with your parent, and in particular, the use of language is a kind of toing and froing, that actually develops the temporal lobe of the brain, and that actually is really important for children's oral language. So that's the first bit of science. So interacting with the child is a really important bit of science. The other bit of science is children's ability to self-regulate. Is a real understanding of that, is a real predictor of how children can then operate in the world, et cetera, and that self-regulation is very related to what's happening in the home. So those two pieces of science sort of also helped us sort of think about what are the sort of conversations we might have with families, that think about what are the sorts of activities parents would like to do that make sense for them around, number one, how they want to bond with their child and talk to their child, and number two, the sorts of things they want to do at home around basic things like food and sleep, without trying to say what was right or wrong, but more understand the science of what was going on and what was going on for those families. I mean, this is very weedy, though. I'm not sure everyone wants all these weeds, but anyway, we'll sit in the weeds for a bit.
Okay, let's move on to good old legitimacy, where people really tend to struggle with some of these things, because especially in these areas, the notion that you are marginalizing people or marginalizing issues, it sounds like an insult, right? Because we're often working with people who we perceive to be marginalized. But the point is that you have to focus on somebody, and by focusing on somebody or something, you marginalize something else. So within your, and if they have sufficient power, those people who are marginalized may actually destroy your project, or at least hinder it in significant ways. Okay. So there are a whole bundle of issues. You've only got to think of the debates around COVID and vaccination to feel that perceptions of marginalization are very powerful and very destructive. So an awareness of, even though you think you're doing very good, they're inevitably, because you have to focus on something, something is going to be outside of that focus. So what, straight up, I mean, who is marginalized by your program?
A really interesting question, because I think when people hear the word marginalize, they automatically think of the very people that we were trying to include in this program.
While just to come in, a very brief talk about language. I'm using the language of the critical systems heuristics. Someone has mentioned the whole issue around beneficiary. I know there are issues, especially in the US, around the word beneficiary, but that's the language in critical systems heuristics. We can play around with that language and turn it into something else. But I just wanted to say that don't be completely wedded to the language that I'm using. I'm trying to reflect the formal language that has been in critical systems for the last 30 odd years. So anyway, Sharon, I jumped in when you were talking about issues around benefits and beneficiaries and marginalization.
And I think this goes to some of the questions that have been coming through as well, which we should probably try and turn to at least some of them fairly soon, which is, and it goes to the kind of policy kind of translation thinking here, which is by focusing a program on the families who probably have the least power in the system, it actually created challenges in thinking about the ongoing feasibility of this approach. So we kind of ended up, I guess, in your parlance, we marginalized the majority. And by marginalizing the majority, we actually had then less cachet to sustain and scale this program because there was less, it was less about the majority. So it's just kind of like, I'm just getting my head around it, almost feels like a double negative. But actually what ended up happening was that by the trade-off was everybody didn't get this because it's not needed as a universal program. But by not everybody getting it, these are the trade-offs also in universal versus targeted. By that trade-off, we probably, in the end, the trade-off was twofold. Number one, it was the majority. And number two, we're actually asking the healthcare workforce to work in a very different way. So that was the other trade-off. We were asking people to work in a deeper way. It took more work. It needed more support. So both of those.
So, oh my God, we could talk about
been more difficult.
Yeah, we could talk about
this
all
night, for a long time.
or all day, or all morning, whichever time zone you guys are in.
We probably should. We should probably now turn to some of the questions that people have got, because we've only got 15 minutes left.
There's just one thing I also wanted to point out in terms of marginalization, which is, of course, that you in the end had to select an area, right, of operation. So in effect, you marginalize people outside of that area. So that it's not only kind of professional boundaries, which I thought was interesting, but also trade-offs around where that program was available. And I suppose final question on this, but probably not the easiest to articulate, is when you were making those trade-offs, what values drove you? In other words, where were the bottom lines and what were those values based on? And then we can kind of If you can answer that in 3 minutes, we can then spend a few minutes
Well, I think they're
widening
kind of
the
relevant
discussion
to
out.
a number of the questions that are coming through, because I think so I think the values is probably at the heart, the total heart of this project, but probably at the total heart of what drives a lot of ECD research. So the values for us at the very, very heart of it was equity and prevention. They were the two. I don't know if prevention's a value, but equity certainly was a value. And that's sort of what drove, that was at the basis of the whole project and the whole program. And equity in terms of delivery, but also equity in terms of power and equity in terms of outcome. So they were really the very heart of the values driving that. And I think we're really clear about that from the get-go.
But in terms of that split between the desirable and the feasible, you had to make trade-offs. What were the values that were behind the trade-offs?
So again, the values were around equity. So the trade-off was, in an ideal world, you could say everybody should get 20 visits from a maternal child health nurse. So we had to trade off the universal, everybody gets something, to the what we call proportionate universal, which is people get according to their need. So that was the other value that we had to that was the trade-off with exactly as you're saying, feasibility in mind.
So who decided the need? What was the need value based on? You see, we can go on forever. Don't answer that.
Yeah, let's stop, Bob, because
let's step back now, because we've only got what?
It's not the Bob and Sharon show.
We've only got a few minutes left. So let's step back.
Oh,
but you can kind of get the idea. I mean, with the people who are the observers of this little corridor, that you can see how even bending around the questions themselves, right? That's why it's a heuristic, is that it's about raising the space for debates to occur that often are not explicit. And one of the reasons why this is in what's generally known as the the emancipatory end of the system stuff is that it's perceived that these discourses are important from a democratic perspective, which is one of the ethical value systems that drove people like C. West Churchman and Ulrich to develop critical systems heuristics, because itself is based on a set of values and assumptions that themselves the practitioners critique all the time. But let's have a look at some of the
and I don't know if Shikufe or Shreya want to bundle any of these. I'm just trying to look through them.
They're so good.
Shikufe, yeah, no, they're really good. Yeah, Shikufe, did you have a look through them?
To ask Bob, did you have any more content to go through? It seemed like you wanted to cover
no more content except a photograph of some books.
Should we stop screen sharing so that we can actually see you guys? But people have enjoyed the conversation. I think they're really riveted by the dialogue. So that's really great.
Thank God it's at night. Otherwise, Sharon and I would go on all day, as it were.
Bob did warn me ahead of time. He said, I can go on for a long time. Make sure you stop me.
So there's a good question.
What do you think, Shikufe?
It says, yeah, so there's a good question by Anita. She asked, so in the case you discussed, going back to the evaluation, if the idea is to focus on parents and health workers and ultimately thinking about positive outcomes for young children, what other evaluations could have been used that would have been primarily important for parents, health practitioners, etc.? And actually, there's so many good questions. There's another one by Luke Williams, is the overarching perspective that if you take a decision within certain boundaries, members outside of those boundaries will always be marginalized. I think that's a really
exactly. And the notion of critical systems is that you have an obligation, an ethical obligation, to consider that. The question is, the problem is, as I pointed out earlier on, is that we make in any intervention, right, millions of boundary choices. So what Ulrich did was say, these three are at the core. They raise those particular, those four question areas. But absolutely right. We make boundary choices every single moment of the day. We make boundary choices crossing the road.
And I think for early childhood development, I think maybe some of our, I mean, I think this kind of purposeful reflective thinking is so important, isn't it? And I think many of us do it, but we probably we haven't codified it in the way that you've codified it in critical heuristics. So I think there is always something to be said for codifying the way many people think anyway. But for ECD, it's like for everything we're thinking about is how do you kind of like a layer cake, how do you actually you're doing all of this not just for one program, but for multiple programs targeting multiple people. So I think that I think Chris Cuthbert had the question about whether you're at a broader level do these critical heuristics kind of work, or are they really more designed for the program level or the micro level? Do you have a view on that, Bob? Because I think there's a lot of thinking here on ECD systems big, and Bob pushed back on me when I said about big systems thinking and systems thinking at the program level. But do you have a thought about that, about the kind of macro version and maybe the meso and micro version?
No, I think it depends really on in the end, you've got to focus on something, and the decision on which you focus on primarily is itself a boundary choice. And you just need to go through a process by saying, to be honest, we need to be aware of, shall we say, for want of a better word, the bigger picture. But actually, in terms of what we've got some authority and control over, to go back to that, what about the things we have absolutely no control over? Or we have the ability to manage, maybe that's a sort of set of criteria by which you would perhaps decide. That would be my own comment. But yes, absolutely, there are so many layers of this particular onion. At some stage, you need to work out which is the best one. Yeah,
I'd be interested to hear, I don't know if there are any policymakers online, but it's interesting. I actually think policymakers have a lot of control over a lot of things, but don't necessarily make these decisions in the way that you're thinking about it, because actually they have a lot of different opportunities, I think, to think about these things at once. They don't have to think program by program. They actually, if they're really great critical thinkers, can think about multiple things. And I don't know what other people think online, but I mean, that's the opportunity in ECD, is multi-sector, multi-sector, multi-layered kind of thinking. So I think that's very, very interesting. Shakufu, where do we go from here? Do we answer more questions online, or there's some people that have got actual hands up?
Yeah.
And I have one question I'd like to answer as a wrap-up. So
yeah,
keep going.
But can I just ask this, because Kelly says great discussion about power, but the end result is still that the RCT is what is held up as the gold standard, who benefits from this and who doesn't. And I know this comes up quite often, so I just wanted to put that out there as well.
Yeah.
I'm going to have a quick answer, and then Bob, you can have the final word, and then we have to give to Shakufa, because then we're going to run out of time.
And then Bob, you can do your wrap-up question as well. Yeah, go
Yeah,
ahead.
it's a great wrap-up question.
So I think RCT, depending on the sector, might be the gold standard, but I just don't think it's the only methodology. In my view, it's horses for courses, and it depends on your values, on how important it is to know whether something's effective. But more importantly than anything else is, does something do harm? And I can tell you there are lots of well-intended interventions that have been that stay delivered in ways that have actually in the end created harm. And so I think people sometimes forget that without doing sometimes these trials, we don't know whether things have done harm, and that harm has come out much later. But it's a much longer conversation. RCT is an approach to evaluation, but it is not the only approach to evaluation. Over to you, Bob.
Yeah, I'm not going to comment on RCTs. I just want to do the wrap-up thing, which ties into the final slide, and I'll just throw it up. hopefully you can see it, is how do you actually do this stuff? Ferran asked, Bob, could you explain how you would go through this heuristics process with a group of people willing to start a project? Any recommendations, how to introduce them, and so on and so forth? That's a phenomenal question and really, really important. There are some people I know who go through the questions in a fairly systematic way. I don't, right? What I do if I'm involved in a design of a particular project is that I have these issues buzzing around my mind, and they inform the questions that I ask, both directly and indirectly. Remember, it's a heuristic, right? It's not a set of given questions. You bend and mess around the questions to some extent. And this final slide is one that I show in all my talks about every single methodology. I've got, talks on just about, well, not every single methodology, there are thousands of them, but at least the ones that I know, are these, kind of be strategic, be careful, be safe, be useful, and be creative. That's a good place to start. So, kind of work out whether you're actually interested in this process. Are you really interested, or is it sort of, yeah, interesting, but, I have other things that are there. Just be careful. I mean, you could see how conversations between Sharon and I could have easily got way out of control. And you just have to be a little bit careful. Be safe. In other words, I used to be a snowboard instructor, right? You would never take people up to the top of the mountain on the first day, right? And even if they were really experienced and they wanted to learn something new, you took them down to the bottom of the mountain. It was often very hard to persuade them to do so, but they usually thanked you in the end. And not play games with people in the sense of just use this when you think it will be useful, right? And be creative. Don't take these questions as, the tablets on writing on a stone tablet. These are ways of generating ideas and discussion. And then the final illustration, which I'm not sure whether it's showing or not, let's just see. Oh no, there we go. Have some fun. It's never be a walk in the park. But it shouldn't be a nightmare for all concerned. And some of these questions can generate conversations which can stop being fun. So just, I hope that helps. I mean, it's a bit vague and a bit imprecise, but that's what I found works for me.
I think it's been really helpful, Bob. And can I just say, I think the ethical overlay for everybody on this call has been really, I'm sure everyone's going to sit back and reflect on this for sure. I do think you might have taken me to the top of the slope and not at the bottom, but I'll go with that anyway. I'll take one for the team. And I might just hand over to Shikufe now to wrap up.
Sharon, it's been great.
Thanks, Bob.
Amazing. What an amazing session, everyone. Really, really amazing. So just to wrap up, thank you again, Sharon and Bob. I mean, I think the comments speak for themselves. That was a riveting session. So thank you to both of you. Again, I feel like a broken record, but please remember to complete the surveys if you want the certificates. The link's been shared out a lot and it's on the website as well. This was the 1 out of 2 of the theme today, and the next session is in a couple hours on mapping causal loops and leverage points within ECD with Aaron Watson. So join you there if you haven't signed up. Can share the link. And then, of course, tomorrow, day 3 of the Masterclass series. And we actually have really exciting sessions. Every day has been really exciting. Tomorrow we move into exploring applications, which is quite exciting. We're actually going to have Nancy Palix from the Palix Foundation who can share from a philanthropy perspective how they've used systems thinking to apply it, and how they've developed a framework to evaluate resilience. And we get to explore how a single philanthropy and a foundation has applied some of this work across their work. And then we have session 6 with Efren Aguilar from the University of California, Los Angeles on Unleash the Power of Equity Measurement and Collective Sense-Making to uncover the roots of population health, resilience, and flourishing. We actually even have the mayor of Pomona, California, who's going to be online with us, Tim Sandoval, and the Deputy Cabinet Secretary for the New Mexico Early Childhood Education and Care Department, and Hero will be our expert, early childhood expert. So that should be exciting. We're actually going to have policymakers on the call as well. Finally, if you want more resources, go to the ECDAN website. Under the thematic pages, we have a page on systems thinking where you can find more resources. Let's continue this conversation over on connect.ecdan.org. Each of the sessions has a thread right now, so we can continue the conversation there, and the experts will be checking in over the next 2 weeks to respond to questions as well. And finally, a big thanks, as always, to the ECDAN team, to Shreya, who's been online and the backbone of this work, Hannah, Catherine, Carol, and Hamid as well, without whom none of this would be possible. So wishing everyone a good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. And yes, spread the word. We want to benefit as many people as possible for the Masterclass series. It's entirely free. So please spread it across your networks, your friends. I think I roped my husband into watching some of these, and he shared it with his colleagues. So spread the word loud and wide. And again, a big thank you to Bob and Sharon for having a riveting session with us today. So thank you to both. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.